The icon and the phantasma, some Platonic roots of Ricoeur's notion of the social imaginary. In his writings from the early to mid-1970s, Paul Ricoeur develops a theory of the social or cultural imaginary around the concept of symbolic mediation of human action constituted through a dialectic of ideology and utopia. During the same period, Ricoeur intervenes in the debate between Hans-Georg Gadamer's hermeneutics of tradition and Jürgen Habermas's ideology critique, which also involved a version of hermeneutics based in Freudian interpretation. Gadamer argued that the methodical approach of ideology critique inescapably involves an alienating distanciation, Verfremdung, from ontological belonging, Zugehörigkeit, to a tradition, which is constituted by historically effected consciousness, Wirkungsgeschichtliches Bewusstsein. The latter is the very condition of the possibility of historical understanding itself by engendering the play, spiel of dialogue that leads to the fusions of horizons. Yet it should be noted that Gadamer's critique of Habermas's ideology critique, which follows at essential points Heidegger's notion of understanding, Verstehen, as ontologically grounded in finite temporality, is also a critique of the epistemological orientation of Enlightenment reflective philosophy itself. Ricoeur's intervention in the debate proceeds characteristically by attempting to mediate the two positions, that is, to fashion a hermeneutics that is both critical and hermeneutical. He poses the problem: how is it possible to introduce a critical instance into a consciousness of belonging, which is expressly defined by the rejection of distanciation? In short, Ricoeur seeks to develop a, quote, critical hermeneutics based on a dialectic of belonging and distanciation, incorporating key concepts from Gadamer's Truth and Method. In this paper, I contend that the basis of Ricoeur's mediation is at a level more fundamental than is often appreciated. My primary task is to sketch out this more fundamental argument. In the process, I believe we can also uncover the basis for a deep continuity between the early and late periods of Ricoeur's philosophy. Briefly stated, I advance a reading that finds the basis of this mediation in a shared starting point of both Gadamer's and Ricoeur's hermeneutical theories in their respective readings of the late Platonic metaphysical dialogues, specifically the Philebus, but also including the Parmenides, the Sophists, the Statesmen, and the Timaeus. My thesis is that we miss something essential in Ricoeur's engagement with Gadamer if this common point of departure is neglected. Once we see the points of commonality, we are in a better position to understand the philosophical motivations for why Ricoeur adopts some key ideas from Gadamer for reasons intrinsic to his own philosophical hermeneutics, the basis of which he had established independently and prior to his later encounter with Truth and Method and the debate between Gadamer and Habermas. I should mention that Ricoeur pursues most of this reading of Plato in the early 1950s through a careful dialectical reading and synthesis of texts by the well-established French experts on Plato, specifically Paul Festeghieri, Victor Brochard, Georges Rodier, Léon Robin, and Jean Wall, among others. In his typical fashion, he finds the limits of each reading of Plato and then incorporates their contributions into a novel interpretation that is his own, though we will see it bears in some respects a striking resemblance to Gadamer's. The shared starting point can be found in 16c to 17a of the Philebus on the method of dialectic, or the, quote, gift of the gods. Both Gadamer and Ricoeur read this passage against the larger theme of the arithmos structure of Platonic thought. Ricoeur points to this passage at key transition points in many of his major works. For example, Infallible Man in the transition from the theoretical synthesis, which focuses on the synthesis of objects, to the practical synthesis that constitutes the practical world or life world, that is the ontological ground of the appearance of objects. Ricoeur states that one cannot start with the whole or totality, but must approach it by degrees. He writes, quoting Philebus 16e to 17ab, Plato had a similar idea when in the Philebus he advised against rushing headlong into the abyss of the infinite or into that of the one, but recommended learning to linger in between. The true philosopher, he said, is the one who, quote, counts and generates number, unquote. One must not, quote, direct oneself straight away toward the one, but again to a number that provides thought with a determinate plurality, and come to the one only after having exhausted the whole order, unquote. What Plato said of the one we can apply to the totality. End of Ricoeur quote. Many interpreters of Plato, going back to certain references to Plato's, quote, unwritten teaching in Aristotle's Metaphysics, identify this determinate plurality, variously translated by Ricoeur as definite number, numbered quantity, intermediary number, regulated multiplicity, as Plato's doctrine of the eidetic arithmoi, or idea numbers. In his 1953 to 1954 course at the University of Strasbourg, entitled in English, Being, Essence, and Substance in Plato and Aristotle, recently published in 2011 in a scholarly edition in French, English translation 2013, Ricoeur emphasizes that this capacity of dialectic is also the capacity of legein, of speaking. Plato, as Ricoeur interprets these dialogues, is actually undertaking a kind of phenomenology along the lines of Husserl's logical investigations, by undertaking an inquiry into the meaning structures that make possible speaking, first about things, then beings, and finally being itself. Language or logos cannot rush too quickly to the one or the good on the one hand, or infinite multiplicity on the other, because both exceed the limits of language and speech. Unlike the sophists, the true philosopher stays within the intermediate realm of a determinate plurality. A recurring theme that winds throughout Plato's dialogues, which Ricoeur emphasizes in the course, is a constant oscillation between the ascending dialectic to the one/good and a descending dialectic that remains within this intermediary level. Ricoeur points out that whenever Plato speaks of actual intuition of the one/good, he always places this within mythological accounts, such as the myth of the soul recounted in the Phaedrus. Ricoeur argues instead, following Jean Wall, that transcendence is captured in and through immanence, or this dialectical method, or in other words, the gift of the gods. On this issue, Ricoeur quotes Philebus 17e, in which Socrates explains that the true philosophical discourse stops before the infima species, where language stretches itself to the extreme of mere indication. Quote, in staying with the infinite multitude of individual things, and with the infinite multiplicity that each of them contains, is to prevent oneself, in each case, from taking a completed notion from this and from becoming a man who counts and numbers, seeing that on the basis of none of them were you able to attain any definite number. End of quote from Philebus 17e. Plato goes on in the Philebus to compare the gift of the gods, or dialectic, to the lettering art in language invented by the Egyptian god Thoth, and musical scales in music. To take the case of letters, vocal sounds are indeterminate or unlimited, apeiron in Greek. But letters, i.e. signifying definite sounds, introduce a determinate that is not an unlimited plurality into this unlimitedness. Later in the Sophists, Plato will compare the eidetic arithmoid structure of the realm of the forms to the way that words are spelled by interweaving vowels and consonants, some of which can mix or combine with all the other letters, and some of which cannot. The, quote, great kinds, unquote, of the Sophists, rest, motion, being, same, and other, also have this unique number structure. To do dialectic, the philosopher must introduce a hierarchization into the structuration of the forms. The great kinds show how the other forms can relate or not relate to one another. In explicating Plato, Ricoeur uses transcendental language. The great kinds form the condition of the possibility of the proper interrelation of all the other forms. The great kinds are known reflectively and constitute a, quote, second order discourse, unquote, which makes explicit the very conditions of the possibility of both thinking and speaking. Significantly for my argument, Ricoeur uses these notions of hierarchization and second order discourse in the concluding parts of both the rule of metaphor and oneself as another. This second order discourse introduces speculative discourse that makes manifest the conditions of the possibility of thinking the truth or ontological reference of poetic discourse in the rule of metaphor. And also in oneself as another, the descriptive, narrative, ethical, moral predicates of human action and suffering. Though I will not demonstrate it in this presentation, I believe that if one listens closely, one can hear variations on Plato's arithmoid language as a leitmotif that runs throughout the first 9 studies of oneself as another. In Gadamer's first book, 1931, entitled Plato's Dialectical Ethics, which was essentially a study of the Philebus, he writes, quote, it is shown that the unity of an idea can include a multiplicity of ideas under it. Just this is the basis of the, quote, solution to the problem of the one and the many, which takes place in the Philebus as a solution to the insoluble problem, which is formulated there too, of methexis, participation. The one is shown to be many, but not as the undefined manifold of things that are coming to be, but as a definite, which means a comprehensible multiplicity of unities, unquote. End of Gadamer quote. In this book, we find the germ of ideas that will later develop into his hermeneutical theory of conversation and Sprachlichkeit in Truth and Method. Human beings encounter the world and other persons through language and dialogue, and the unthematized ground of this conversation is the logoi, structured through dialectic. Through the method of division, diaresis, and collection, synagogue, guided by an apprehension of the good, human beings can come to a greater awareness of this unthematized ground of manifestation. There is always a definite number, a togetherness within a dialectically related plurality of ideas, each cluster nested within a larger cluster, and so on. In short, an articulated structure. This one-many structure, as the ground of manifestation, is the basis of Gadamer's thesis of the linguisticality, Sprachlichkeit, of being in Truth and Method, summed up in the famous statement, being that can be understood is language, unquote. As I will lay out in a later section, this one-many structure of disclosure also undergirds the concepts of mimesis, aesthetic non-differentiation, and play, or spiel, in being and time, historically effective consciousness, and the fusion of horizons, and his use of Augustine's conceptions of the verbum and trinity, Cusanus's complicatio explicatio metaphysics, and the metaphoricity of language itself. In each, the being of the one manifests itself in appearance or presentation, but this urbild, or interpretation, or of metaphysical fecundity is not an inessential part of the event of truth or being. The multiplicity is part of the one. For Gadamer, following Plato, this dialectical structure always involves a second-degree set of ontological ideas, the great kinds of rest, motion, being, same, and the other, that structures this dialectic. In contrast to objects of episteme, which always remain the same, human existence and temporality always involve a mixture of the same and the other. Therefore, it is only the Aristotelian intellectual virtue of phronesis that can grasp this being, which always entails otherness, because phronetic judgment pertains to things or situations that in each case can be otherwise. Gadamer explicitly connects such arguments to Plato's eidetic arithmos, a term for this structure that first appears in Aristotle's Metaphysics, in which Aristotle reports that Plato actually had a, quote, unwritten doctrine, unquote, which he only revealed orally in a lecture on the good delivered to a select audience. A group of Plato scholars in Germany, the so-called Tübingen School, have attempted to reconstruct this unwritten teaching. Against this idea, Gadamer argues in his essay, Plato's Unwritten Dialectic, that there was no such esoteric teaching. Rather, the teaching is the praxis of Platonic dialectic itself, or dialogue, properly understood in terms of its arithmos structure. Although it is not explicit, the arithmos structure is a master operative concept in Truth and Method, but it is explicit in Gadamer's early work as well as his later essays. In a similar fashion, Ricoeur extensively engages this Platonic arithmology in his early teaching at the University of Strasbourg. In his 1953 to 1954 course, Ricoeur constructs his own complex reading of the relation between dialectic and arithmology in Plato, which is partly based on a, quote, celebrated, unquote, article by Georges Rodier, published in 1902, titled, in English, Mathematics and Dialectic in the System of Plato. In Fallible Man, Ricoeur explicitly ties his exploration of the Kantian productive imagination to Plato's concept of the mixture, or generated essence in the Philebus, which I will now show is based on this arithmos structure. At the end of the paper, I will discuss how this enables Ricoeur to appropriate key aspects of Gadamer's hermeneutics, but additionally to situate these within reflective philosophy, thereby allowing a critical dimension, even while the same notions, by contrast, lead Gadamer, following Heidegger, to reject reflexive philosophy as based on ontotheology. In Fallible Man, Ricoeur develops a philosophical anthropology of human existence as an intermediary between the infinite and the finite, a concept he in part draws from Descartes' Fourth Meditation, but that has a lineage that extends back through Augustine to Plato. In the later metaphysical dialogues, Plato grounds this idea in the arithmos structure of dialectic. As already noted, this method of dialectic proceeds by finding an intermediate region between the one and the many. On Ricoeur and Rodier's reading, this interval is found in the, quote, in-between, unquote, entre deux, or middle range, between the one and infinite multiplicity. The dialectician locates a determinate zone of multiplicity, or a plurality of forms that is understood as limited in number, but also that each form has a definite limit, each the same as itself, in its dialectical relation to other definite forms, as well as to the indeterminate otherness from which they must be differentiated, as being other than. Dialectic always involves developing an articulated logos, speech, language, thought, of interrelated forms through a method of division, diaresis, and collection, synagogue. The latter provides a, quote, unifying vision, unquote, that gathers together, in Greek, legein, this articulated whole. The motivation behind the new method, according to Ricoeur's reading, lies in Plato's recognition of a problem plaguing his earlier, more naive theory of the forms, the question of the participation of different forms in one another. Plato refers to this issue variously in different dialogues as the problem of participation, methexis, of some forms in other forms, or their communion, koinonia, of all the forms with one another. Plato's deepest exploration of this issue is found in the Sophists. In this highly dialectical dialogue, the Eleatic stranger proposes his hard-won solution modeled on the spelling art. Like vowels and consonants, some forms are incapable of mixing or communing with one another, while other forms are capable of such mixing with other forms. In the Philebus, Socrates enlists the dialectical method, the gift of the gods, to solve the problem that is the main topic of the dialogue, namely the question of whether pleasure or intelligence is the highest principle of the good life. Socrates' answer comes in the form of four kinds, or geni, or principles. Limit, in Greek peros, unlimitedness, aperon, the mixture, mikton, of the two, and the cause of the mixtures, which turns out to be intelligence, or nous. Mixtures, or mikta, are well-formed complex wholes, such as music or health. The limited refers to something having a definite limit, peros, such as a form, an eidos, as well as the unifying principle of this limitedness itself, the one itself. The unlimited encompasses the realm of the indefinite, changing, infinite, and formless, the aperon. The mixture, or mikton, refers to a blending in a proper way of the limited and the unlimited that generates complex unities and the world of becoming in general. And finally, there must be an intelligence, nous, as the cause, or arche, of this proper mixture. In the opening chapter of Fallible Man, the pathétique of misery, Ricoeur also refers to the third principle, mixture, as the, quote, generated essence, unquote. This concept of generated essence appears at Philebus 26d. Intelligence is the cause of the peros aperon mixture as a, quote, coming into being, created through the measures imposed by the limit. Genesis eis ousion, coming into being. Ekton mekta tau peritas apergas menon metron. The question of what kind of measure, metron, precisely this is, becomes a highly significant issue for Rodier and Ricoeur. I will return to this important matter later to explain Rodier's analysis of the distinction between the mathematical measure and the just measure that Ricoeur adopts as the heart of his interpretation of Plato in the course. By establishing this understanding of dialectic as structured as an arithmos, or regulated multiplicity, Plato lays the foundation to simultaneously solve two problems of the early theory of the forms. First, as mentioned earlier, the participation of the intelligible forms in and with one another, the koinonia, or communion of the forms. And secondly, the participation of sensible becoming in intelligible being of the forms. The explanation of participation in the early theory, based on an image-copy metaphor, was found to be aporetic and inscrutable. As noted above, a major argument made by Ricoeur in the course is that the late dialogues introduce a, quote, second-degree ontology, unquote, that both supplements and corrects the naive Platonism of the early dialogues. The, quote, first-degree ontology, unquote, is the theory of the forms that identified being as a simple self-identical unity of each form. In the naive Platonism of the early dialogues, The concept of being was simply the self-identity or self-sameness of each form as having a definite limit and oneness. But in the later dialogues, such as the Parmenides, Plato asks, can a form be simple and one, all by itself, and still have being? If a form such as justice has being, would it not thereby be two things, i.e. justice and being, and no longer one? In the Parmenides, Plato applies this logic game to the unifying principle itself, the one. If the one does not have being, does it exist? If being is simple unity, can there be attribution and relation? Furthermore, is there a sense of is that is existential in distinction from the purely relational sense, as in the copula? In naive Platonism, there was not a clear distinction between being and beingness of forms, or eidos. Eventually, Plato faced the question of whether it is even possible to speak of any form as being self-identical without differentiating it from another. And finally, in the Sophists, in speaking about something not being something else, Plato runs up against the injunction of Parmenides that true philosophy can speak only of what is true and cannot speak of non-being or things that, quote, are not, unquote. This becomes a further complexity in the problem of the koinonia, or communion of the forms. But now armed with the Philebus analysis, Plato can solve the problem of the participation of becoming, the world of appearances, in the realm of the forms. In his early naive Platonism, Plato had characterized sensible appearances as mere copies or images of the forms. Plato had regarded things in the world of sensible becoming as lacking in being in any sense because they were mere shadows. These shadows, copies, were imperfect, devoid of unity and form. Becoming was the mere appearance of being, flickering shadows of reality, entrancing and trapping people in the cave of opinion. However, equipped with the principle of the generated essence, Plato now has the means to save the being of appearances or images. On Ricoeur's reading, this argument comes into full view only in the Timaeus. Through the notion of the generated essence from the Philebus, it is no longer inconceivable for the limited or form to enter into the unlimited formlessness. Just as intelligence is the cause of the mixture or generated essence in the Philebus, the demiurge of the Timaeus fulfills the role of the causal agent responsible for the creation of the cosmos as an ordered whole. I will return to this important issue below in relation to the Kantian productive imagination. In the chorus, Ricoeur places these problems on two axes, horizontal and vertical. The horizontal axis refers to the problem of the participation of the forms among themselves within the intelligible realm. The vertical axis refers to the problem of participation of sensible becoming in the forms. According to Ricoeur, the purpose of the two parts of the Parmenides, one of his most laborious and aporetic of dialogues, is to thematize these two problematics of participation. In what follows, I will first examine Ricoeur's analysis of the horizontal axes, and secondly, his novel interpretation of the second axis, or vertical participation. I am now going to end the reading of the presentation. There are several other sections, as I alluded to at the beginning. I go into a section on Gadamer and do a fuller explication of some of Gadamer's key ideas in Truth and Method. And then finally, the concluding section is to show that Ricoeur incorporates the idea of the arithmal structure and the generated essence and productive imagination into reflective philosophy, thereby making possible what he calls a critical hermeneutics. Therefore, he is able to utilize some concepts from Gadamer's Truth and Method, but at the same time to insist on a moment of critical distanciation. Thank you.